If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars, could be a 50 or 100%, because we don't want their cars.
Critical. I love the idea or the aspiration of a Canadian car.
In early 2025, the political climate between the US and Canada took a sharp turn when Donald Trump made a bold statement: every car sold in America should be built in America. This proclamation wasn't merely rhetoric, it quickly morphed into a fierce set of policies, ushering in a series of trade penalties targeting Canada's automotive sector. Trump's tariffs were swift and severe. First came the steel tariffs, followed by aluminum levies, and ultimately, a hefty 25% tariff on finished vehicles imported from Canada. The message was loud and clear. Washington had no intention of tolerating any more cross-border production. The reason behind this wasn't just about protectionism or national pride, it was about exerting pressure. It was a move that would have far-reaching consequences not just for Canada but also for American automakers themselves. This wasn't just about economics. The administration framed it as a strategic reset, but for companies already entrenched in decades of integrated supply chains, it felt like economic whiplash. For years, the modern North American car had been assembled through a well-choreographed partnership between the US and Canada. A piston might start its life as aluminum mined in Quebec, pass through Ontario for molding, then end up in Detroit for finishing. This highly specialized, cross-border production process was far from inefficient. It was a carefully honed system that allowed Ford, GM, and Stellantis to optimize costs and reduce delays. Canada focused on high-volume basic components like castings and stampings, while the US took charge of final assembly, electronics, and software. This partnership, fostered over decades, had worked under the frameworks of the 1965 Auto Pact, NAFTA, and more recently, the USMCA. It was a stable environment that allowed Detroit to stay competitive globally. But now, Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods were threatening to tear apart this delicate web of cooperation. The stakes were incredibly high. Disrupting the system wasn't just costly, it threatened to undo the foundation of North America's automotive competitiveness. While the tariffs were positioned as a way to protect American jobs, they had a far broader impact. The 25% tariff on Canadian vehicles, combined with a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, sent shockwaves through the entire industry. By mid-2025, Ford and Stellantis had both paused production lines in Ontario, citing escalating costs and plummeting demand. General Motors, in turn, ramped up production of trucks in Indiana, pulling resources away from Canada. The ripple effects were immediate and severe. Stellantis reported losses up to $5 billion due to the tariffs, a staggering figure that underscored the damage. Ford wasn't far behind in its estimates. The Canadian auto parts industry, which supplied nearly half of its output to US plants, saw its order books dry up. And it wasn't just the automakers who were affected. Canada's specialized manufacturing sector, which provided tooling and molds for the automotive industry, was also in turmoil. At the heart of this crisis was a massive shift in production strategy. The United Auto Workers, UAW in Michigan, warned that the political uncertainty could undo years of labor deals and modernization plans at American factories. In essence, Trump's tariff policies weren't just creating economic damage, they were shaking the very foundation of labor relations in the automotive sector. But the situation wasn't just causing frustration for the automotive industry, it was forcing Canada into a precarious position. Trump's aggressive stance gave Canada little room to maneuver. The looming threat of retaliation from Canada was making it increasingly difficult for US automakers to justify the rising costs and supply chain disruptions. Yet, despite the political standoff, the situation wasn't as clear-cut as Trump might have imagined. The auto industry wasn't just shifting operations to the US, it was increasingly looking south to Mexico, or in some cases, halting reinvestment altogether. As Canada faced the very real threat of retaliation by mid-July 2025, including potential tariffs on American auto exports, it was becoming apparent that the trade war could backfire. The US was at risk of losing its second-largest foreign market, which could harm American jobs and the broader economy. Trump's strategy of America First was not guaranteed to produce the outcomes he had envisioned. At the same time, the impact on consumers was undeniable. As tariffs pushed prices higher, average US families were now paying an additional $1,300 per year for cars and appliances. Meanwhile, the ripple effect was equally felt across the border in Canada. Canadian consumers were increasingly reluctant to purchase US-made vehicles, with dealerships in Ontario and Quebec reporting a 30% drop in sales of US brands. Some Canadian dealerships had already begun shifting focus to European and Korean models, anticipating a shift in consumer preferences due to the escalating trade tensions. As the clock ticked down, Canada's trade strategy began to take shape. Prime Minister Mark Carney set a deadline for July 21st to either reach a deal or proceed with retaliatory tariffs, signaling that the negotiations were quickly approaching a breaking point. In the face of mounting pressure, Canada had already begun to make changes to its domestic policies to protect itself, including requiring steel from domestic sources for government procurement contracts. But none of these efforts were enough to stabilize the situation completely. Trump, for his part, had framed the tariffs as a mechanism to protect American jobs and punish what he described as unfair trade. Yet, for all his bluster, he may have underestimated the far-reaching consequences of his actions. As U.S. automakers grappled with cost increases and supply chain disruptions, and as Canadian workers faced job losses due to the collapse of the steel sector, the bigger picture was becoming clear. This was more than a trade war. It was a crisis of confidence. The North American auto industry was facing a real existential threat, one that could not be solved through tariffs alone. The uncertain future of the industry, marked by factory shutdowns and shifting production lines, would reverberate for years to come. The question remained, was this the price of protecting American jobs? Or was it an example of how unpredictable political decisions could wreck decades of cooperation? As July 2025 drew closer, the trade war between the US and Canada reached a critical juncture. For months, the escalating tariffs and the resulting political standoff had left the automotive industry in turmoil. What had begun as a political maneuver to force Canada into a more favorable trade agreement had now spiraled into a full-blown crisis with consequences that were hard to ignore. President Trump's rhetoric had promised a rebirth of American manufacturing, but the reality was proving far more chaotic. By mid-2025, Canadian vehicle exports to the U.S. had dropped significantly, by nearly 23% in April alone, due to the 25% auto tariff that Trump had imposed. For U.S. buyers, the price of Canadian vehicles was soaring, leading to a decline in sales of popular models. But the fallout wasn't just a matter of sales and prices, it was also about trust. American automakers, already reeling from the impact of these tariffs, were facing an uncertain future as their Canadian counterparts struggled to adapt to the new economic landscape. On the Canadian side of the border, the loss of key markets like the US was becoming painfully evident. Historically, Canada had been one of the largest buyers of US-made vehicles, with over 1.8 million cars crossing the border annually. But with the tariffs making US vehicles more expensive, Canadian dealerships were experiencing a rapid decline in sales. Many were seeing customers opt for foreign brands, such as Korean and European models, leaving US car makers in the dust. The economic pressure was palpable in communities like Windsor, Ontario, where many automotive workers had long relied on cross-border production. With Stellantis scaling back production and U.S. automakers diverting resources to Mexico, local economies were beginning to suffer. Workers in Canada were feeling the heat as jobs in the auto industry and related sectors such as steel and aluminum were increasingly at risk. The Canadian Steel Producers Association reported that nearly 1,000 jobs had been lost due to the 50% steel tariff, with more layoffs looming on the horizon. The ripple effect of Trump's tariffs was spreading far beyond the factories, hitting small towns and regional economies that depended on the automotive industry. For the U.S., the fallout was just as severe. American automakers, already facing rising production costs, were seeing their operations in Canada and Mexico face mounting difficulties. Some plants were forced to scale back production, while others were simply shut down. Ford's production in Ontario was temporarily halted, while Stellantis faced staggering losses that reached as high as $5 billion in one quarter. Despite these losses, the U.S. government maintained its hardline stance, unwilling to back down on the tariffs, even as job losses mounted and economic instability deepened. What's more, the uncertainty surrounding these trade disruptions was spilling into labor relations. The United Auto Workers, UAW, which had recently negotiated new labor agreements with automakers, had begun to voice concerns about the long-term impacts of the shifting production strategies. UAW leaders in Michigan warned that the political chaos surrounding trade policy was destabilizing labor relations and undermining the hard-won progress made in recent contract negotiations. If production lines continued to shift unpredictably, the UAW feared that new deals could unravel, further compounding the uncertainty for workers on both sides of the border. The Canadian government, meanwhile, was taking steps to mitigate the damage. In an attempt to shield its steel sector, which had been the first casualty of Trump's tariffs, Canada began implementing domestic procurement policies requiring the use of homegrown steel in government contracts. Yet the situation was becoming increasingly dire. Catherine Cobden, president of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, warned that the steel industry's blast furnaces couldn't just pause production, they might never restart. The clock was ticking on industries already struggling to survive, and without a resolution in sight, Canadian workers and families were bearing the brunt of the crisis. But the real twist in this trade saga lay in the fact that despite the chaos, neither side seemed to have a clear path to a resolution. Trump's hard-nosed approach, which had initially been celebrated by his political base as a victory for American workers, had now put the entire North American automotive ecosystem in jeopardy. With tariffs escalating, American companies faced the very real possibility that their key suppliers in Canada and Mexico would be pushed to the brink of collapse, rendering the entire auto industry less competitive globally. The situation also raised troubling questions about the future of U.S.-Canada relations. Trump's rhetoric, which included the suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state, was not only a blow to trade negotiations, it was a blunt statement of power and control. The shock of that statement reverberated through the political sphere, leaving Canada to contemplate its next moves. While Prime Minister Mark Carney had so far avoided direct confrontation, the Canadian government was under increasing pressure to find a way out of the standoff. Trade talks between the US and Canada were, for all practical purposes, at a standstill. Trump had made it clear that he was done negotiating unless Canada conceded to his demands, particularly concerning the Digital Services Tax, DST, that Canada had introduced as a way to generate much-needed revenue from major US tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta. For Trump, the DST was an affront, a direct attack on US interests that warranted swift retaliation. And while the tax had been in the works for years, it was the moment of collection that triggered Trump's fury. But the tension surrounding the DST wasn't the only issue at play. Trump had long held disdain for Canada's agricultural policies, particularly its supply management system, which protects Canadian dairy, poultry, and egg farmers through quotas and price controls. This issue had been a sticking point in previous NAFTA talks, and despite the fact that the system remained largely intact in the USMCA, Trump was still pressing Canada to make concessions. The trade war was no longer just about tariffs, it was about power, leverage, and legacy. Trump was testing the limits of trade diplomacy itself, and in doing so he was betting that Canada would cave under the pressure. But Canada was proving more resilient than he might have anticipated. Behind closed doors, Carney and his team were engaged in quiet diplomacy, trying to salvage whatever they could from the wreckage of the trade negotiations. It was clear, however, that this was no longer just a question of trade policy. It was about the future of US-Canada relations, and the political and economic risks that both sides would face in the months and years to come. As the summer of 2025 loomed, the trade war between the US and Canada had evolved into something much larger and more complex than anyone had initially anticipated. What began as a series of tariff threats and trade demands had transformed into a full-blown geopolitical crisis. The effects were not only felt in the factories and boardrooms but also in the pockets of everyday people who were paying the price for this volatile political game. For US consumers, the impact was stark. As tariffs on Canadian vehicles, steel, and aluminum continued to climb, the cost of living in the US spiked, with families now shelling out an additional $1,300 annually for cars and appliances alone. This increase came on the back of rising prices for goods that had already been made more expensive by global inflation and supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. American automakers, already struggling with the pressures of production delays and shifting supply chains, found themselves facing an additional problem: a lack of consumer confidence. With prices climbing and uncertainty hanging over the auto industry, consumers were hesitant to make major purchases. Many were holding off on buying new cars, unsure whether the models they wanted would even be available a few months down the line. Dealerships in both the US and Canada were experiencing disruptions in their inventory, with production schedules becoming increasingly erratic. Despite short-term sales boosts at companies like Ford and Hyundai, experts warned that this uptick was merely a product of consumers rushing to buy before prices rose even further. Demand was being pulled forward, not grown. In Canada, the situation was even more dire. The automotive sector, which had long been a key pillar of the Canadian economy, was on the brink of collapse. Canada's steel industry, which had been hit hardest by the US tariffs, was bleeding jobs and resources. As steel plants in Ontario and Quebec slowed down or shuttered, entire communities that depended on these industries for employment began to buckle under the pressure. Prime Minister CARNEY, though trying to maintain composure, knew that the clock was ticking. His government had imposed tariffs of its own, but it was clear that retaliatory measures could only go so far in the face of the mounting economic strain. This was not just a matter of economics, it was also a matter of national security and global competitiveness. Canada and the US had built one of the world's most integrated and efficient manufacturing ecosystems over the last century, particularly in the automotive sector. The disruption of this delicate system wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a strategic blunder. As US automakers moved production lines to Mexico or shut down plants altogether, the cost of this disintegration was becoming apparent. In the long run, it wasn't just Canada that would suffer. American workers and consumers were also on the losing end. For Trump, this was not just about trade, it was a power play. The president had used tariffs as a way to assert dominance, both over Canada and the broader global economic order. The suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state was more than just political bluster, it was a rhetorical tool to signal to his base, and to the world, that the US was willing to go to extreme lengths to ensure that it could dictate the terms of international trade. Critics were quick to label it as mere theater, a move designed to grab headlines and distract from more pressing issues at home. But for Trump, it was a calculated strategy designed to force Canada into a corner. However, this strategy had its risks. By pushing Canada into a defensive position, Trump had not only alienated a longtime ally, but also tested the limits of US influence in the global economy. Canada, while a key trading partner, was not the only player on the world stage. As trade tensions increased, Canada turned its gaze inward, making plans to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on the US market. While Canada had resisted giving in to Trump's demands, it also understood the strategic importance of maintaining relationships with other global powers. That meant looking to Europe and Asia as potential new partners in trade. The Digital Services Tax, DST, which had been the spark for the latest round of trade tensions, was also a critical issue that revealed the deeper divides between the two nations. Trump's view that this tax represented an attack on American companies had been the catalyst for his hardline stance. Yet Canada, struggling to balance its budget and find new sources of revenue, saw the DST as a necessary measure to address the challenges of a changing global economy. This fundamental difference in priorities and values had made it difficult for the two countries to come to the table and find common ground. In Washington, meanwhile, Trump's own political future was increasingly uncertain. His 90-day deadline for striking new trade deals was quickly approaching, and his ambitious domestic agenda was facing resistance in Congress. The Senate in particular was balking at some of his proposals, and even his once closest allies, like Elon Musk, were beginning to publicly question his economic priorities. Trump's critics were quick to point out that while he had promised a rebirth of American manufacturing, the reality was far more complicated. Instead of a manufacturing renaissance, the US was facing a crisis of confidence in its own industries. The disruptions in trade had led to chaos in the supply chain, rising costs, and a looming jobs crisis that no amount of tariffs could fix. As the deadline for a trade deal loomed, the future of US-Canada relations remained in the balance. Canada had resisted Trump's demands for the DST to be repealed and for further concessions on agricultural protections. In the US, Trump's political advisors were already preparing for the worst, knowing that a failure to secure a deal with Canada would have serious implications for his re-election campaign in 2026. But even if a deal were struck, it was unlikely that the damage to both countries' economies could be fully repaired. The question now was whether Trump would continue to pursue his aggressive stance, pushing for more tariffs and leveraging his position for political gain, or whether he would concede to a deal that might allow the two countries to rebuild their once thriving trade relationship. For Canada, the road ahead was equally uncertain. As the July deadline approached, both nations were bracing for the economic fallout that would come if they failed to reach an agreement. In the end, this trade war was about more than just cars, steel, and aluminum. It was about the future of North American cooperation, the stability of global supply chains, and the ability of two nations to find common ground in an increasingly polarized world. The stakes were higher than ever, and for millions of families, the ultimate cost would be borne not just in economic terms, but in the uncertainty that loomed over their futures. As President Trump pressed for leverage and Canada pushed back, one thing became clear. The cost of unpredictability was being paid by the workers, consumers, and families on both sides of the border. The trade war was far from over, and its long-term consequences remained